I'm looking for someone named Willem around this. He might be able to help me.
Who are you? What good are you to me if I help you?
She wasn't a soldier. She wasn't a spy. She was a secretary who said yes when it would have been so much easier to say no. A Small Light didn't just tell the story of Anne Frank's hiding, it told the story of the woman who made the hiding possible. And behind the scenes, nothing about bringing that story to life was simple. The cast broke down crying between takes. The writers fought to keep the darkness honest. And one real person, still alive when production began, never got to see herself on screen. These are 20 dark facts about A Small Light. And the bonus, the one detail even the showrunners said, they weren't sure they were ready to film. Stay with it. This one doesn't let go. Easy.
I need your help hiding my family. You need to take your time to think it.
Number 1. Before a single frame was shot, the creators of A Small Light, Joan Rader and Tony Phelan, faced a question that nearly stopped the project cold. How do you tell the story the world thinks it already knows? Anne Frank's diary is one of the most read books in human history. Generations of students have sat with those words, cried over that ending, closed the cover, and believed they understood. But Rader and Phelan weren't making a story about Anne Frank. They were making a story about Miep Gies, the woman in the background, the one history footnoted and then quietly forgot. And that meant tearing apart every assumption the audience would walk in carrying. They couldn't rely on the familiar tragedy as a crutch. They had to make viewers fall in love with Miep first, completely, before the darkness came. It was a structural risk that terrified the network. What if audiences didn't connect? What if they kept waiting for Anne instead of investing in this ordinary woman with extraordinary nerve? Rader and Phelan didn't flinch. They said the whole point was the ordinariness. Miep wasn't a legend who woke up ready for history. She was a young woman in love, worried about groceries, afraid of being caught, making impossible decisions one small terrifying day at a time. Getting audiences to accept the framing that heroism could look this quiet and this scared, that was the first and hardest battle before filming ever started. Number 2. Belle Powley had read Anne Frank's diary as a child, like most people. But when she was cast as Miep Gies in A Small Light, she did something most actors wouldn't think to do. She put the diary down and picked up Miep's own memoir instead. The 1987 book, written with journalist Alison Leslie Gold, is a document unlike anything in the popular record of the Holocaust. It's calm, it's specific. It remembers the smell of the canal in the morning, and the sound of boots on cobblestones, and the exact feeling of lying to a Nazi officer's face with a basket of bread under one arm. Powley said in interviews that the memoir disturbed her in ways the diary never had. Not because it was more graphic, but because it was more ordinary. Miep wrote about fear the way most people write about traffic, as a constant inconvenience you learn to move through. She wrote about guilt with the same plainness. She didn't perform her heroism. She almost resented being called a hero. And Powley had to carry all of that. The guilt, the grief, the refusal to be mythologized into every single scene. She spent weeks walking Amsterdam with the memoir in her bag, reading passages on bridges, in markets, in alleyways. She wasn't preparing for a role. She was trying to understand how someone chooses to survive when the people they loved didn't.
Let's do this.
Number 3. The production made a decision early that sent quiet shockwaves through the entire creative team. They would not show the arrest. Everyone knew it was coming. The moment the Gestapo arrived at the secret annex on August 4th, 1944, is arguably the most documented, most dramatized, most written about event in Holocaust literature. Other films had staged it with maximum devastation, cameras pushing through doors, faces collapsing, children pulled from hiding places. A Small Light chose silence instead. The writers argued that the audience already carried the weight of that moment inside them. Showing it again, they said, risked turning trauma into spectacle. What they did instead was harder to execute and ultimately more devastating. They showed Miep downstairs at her desk, hearing sounds and not moving, just sitting, just listening to footsteps above her, and understanding without being told. Powley said, filming that stillness was one of the most difficult things she had ever done on camera. There was no big scene to play, no lines to deliver, no movement to hide behind. Just a woman at a desk, knowing. and the camera holding on her face long enough for the audience to know too. The choice drew enormous praise from critics and from Holocaust scholars who said it honored the reality of how atrocity is often experienced, not as spectacle witnessed, but as sound heard through a ceiling, and the terrible silence that comes after. Number 4. Miep Gies was still alive when A Small Light was in early development. She died in January 2010 at the age of 100, and the production team was acutely aware that the story they were building had been lived by a real woman who had spent decades quietly correcting the record about who she was and what she had done. Miep spent her later years traveling the world, speaking to school groups, pushing back against the word hero every single time it was aimed at her. She said it made her uncomfortable because if people believed that hiding the Franks required extraordinary courage, they might excuse themselves from similar acts of resistance by assuming they weren't brave enough. Her argument was simpler and darker. Anyone could have done what she did. Most people just didn't. The writers of A Small Light took that discomfort seriously and built it directly into the DNA of the series. They didn't write Miep as a woman who always knew the right thing to do. They wrote her as someone who was often terrified, occasionally resentful, sometimes furious at what she had agreed to carry. The show's version of Miep snaps at Otto Frank. She drinks too much some nights. She cries in her kitchen alone. Not because it diminishes her, but because Miep herself always insisted that her humanity, her smallness, her fear was the point. Anything less would have been a betrayal. Number 5. Joe Cole, who played Miep's husband Miep Gies, prepared for the role by researching not just Jan's known biography, but the specific psychology of men in the Dutch resistance. What he found was disturbing in ways the script didn't fully explore. Miep Gies was a committed anti-fascist from early in the occupation. He worked with resistance networks, forged documents, secured ration cards, and moved in circles where the risk of arrest and execution was constant and known. But what Cole discovered was the toll that kind of sustained double life took on ordinary relationships. Jan couldn't tell Miep everything. He couldn't always explain why he came home late, why he was jumpy, why certain names made him go quiet. The resistance required compartmentalization so complete it essentially built a wall inside a marriage. Cole said he had to play a man who loved his wife deeply, while also, functionally, lying to her to protect her. And the tragedy embedded in that, the tenderness wrapped inside the deception, was something he kept returning to throughout filming. In one particular scene, where Jan and Miep argue about what they've taken on, Cole said he kept thinking about all the things his character couldn't say out loud. All the nights Jan had sat in rooms deciding the fate of strangers while trying not to bring that weight home. It gave his performance a quality critics called haunted. It was, because the research warranted nothing less.
We have to choose when we fight them. We don't let them choose for us.
Number 6. The secret annex itself presented a production design challenge that became almost philosophical. The real building at Prinsengracht 263 in Amsterdam is now a museum, visited by millions. Everyone knows what it looks like from photographs, from films, from the diary itself. The production team had to build a version of that space that felt both faithful and fresh, familiar and suffocating in new ways. They made a choice that initially divided the creative team. They built the set smaller than the historical dimensions. Not dramatically, but enough that the actors would feel it in their bodies. Claustrophobia you perform is different from claustrophobia you inhabit. Director Susanna White, who helmed several episodes, said she wanted the walls to do work that dialogue couldn't. She wanted the audience to feel the specific cruelty of spending 2 years in rooms that shrink a little every day, while the city outside moves normally, while people laugh in the street, while seasons change through a single small window. Belle Powley said the first time she walked into the completed set, she had to stop. Not for any dramatic reason, just because the physical reality of it, the low ceilings, the cramped stairway, the single toilet behind a thin wall, hit her in the chest in a way that research and reading hadn't managed. The space worked. It worked so well that the cast began instinctively lowering their voices between takes, moving carefully, not making noise. The walls had done exactly what they were meant to do.
Asking you to do is dangerous. If you get caught, you could get arrested or even...
Number 7. One of the darkest choices the writers made was refusing to sanitize Otto Frank. In most tellings of the Anne Frank story, Otto occupies a position of almost saintly grief. He's the father who survived, the man who gave the diary to the world, the gentle patriarch whose love for his daughter radiates from every page. A small light complicated that image with precision and without apology. The show portrays Otto as a man who sometimes makes decisions that put Miep in danger without fully accounting for what he's asking. He leans on her in ways that blur the line between gratitude and exploitation. He carries the authority of a father figure while simultaneously placing an almost unbearable burden on a young woman who is not his child and did not create his crisis. The writers were careful. They didn't make Otto villainous. They made him human, which in some ways is harder to watch. Liev Schreiber, who played Otto, said he found the role more morally complex than anything he had attempted before. He was playing a man the world had already canonized, and he had to bring friction to that icon without disrespecting the historical record or the real man's legacy. Schreiber said he kept asking himself what it actually costs another person when you accept their sacrifice without fully naming it. That question sat inside his performance all the way through. You can feel it every time Otto says, "Thank you to Miep." The weight of what thank you can never cover. Number 8. The production filmed in Amsterdam, and the decision to shoot on location carried consequences nobody fully anticipated. Certain streets in the Jordan district, where the Frank family had lived, and where Miep had walked every day during the occupation, looked almost unchanged from the 1940s. Cobblestones, canal reflections, narrow facades. The crew could dress the streets without extraordinary effort and achieve something that felt immediately real. But those same streets are walked daily by the descendants of people who lived through that occupation and by tourists who come to the Anne Frank house to confront a history that is still raw in ways that outsiders sometimes underestimate. There were days when production had to pause because local residents watched filming from their windows and didn't leave. They just stood there. Some of the older ones knew what building was being referenced. They knew what had happened in that neighborhood. One crew member described a moment when an elderly Dutch woman approached the set and watched a scene in silence for nearly 20 minutes before walking away without speaking. Nobody asked her to leave. Nobody asked what she was thinking. There was nothing to say. The show was being made about real people in a real place where the memory wasn't archival. It was personal. It was still alive in people's bodies, and the weight of that presence never left the production, even on days when everything was technically going smoothly. Number 9. The show goes to a place most World War II dramas avoid with particular care. It shows collaboration, not the dramatic collaboration of Nazi officers or active informants, but the soft, terrified, incremental collaboration of ordinary Dutch citizens who looked away, who answered questions they could have deflected, who made calculations about their own survival that cost other people theirs. The writers said this was the thread they were most nervous about pulling. Dutch national identity in relation to World War II is complicated and has been a subject of historical reckoning for decades. The Netherlands had one of the highest rates of Jewish deportation in Western Europe, and the reasons for that are not simple and not comfortable. A small light doesn't deliver verdicts. It doesn't frame collaboration as evil and resistance as good in clean opposing columns. It shows how fear works on people gradually, how the small surrenders pile up into something monstrous before anyone quite names it, how most people aren't heroes and aren't villains, but are something in between that history tends not to know how to categorize. Several Dutch historians consulted on the production said they were moved by this particular thread, not because it absolved anyone, but because it showed the mechanism of moral erosion with the kind of accuracy that makes you stop and ask quietly in your most honest private moment what you would actually have done. Number 10. Miep Gies saved Anne Frank's diary pages by gathering them from the floor of the secret annex after the arrest. She didn't read them. She locked them in her desk drawer and kept them there for the rest of the war, through months of terror and uncertainty, waiting for a return she hoped for and feared would never come. When Otto Frank came back from Auschwitz, the only surviving member of his immediate family, Miep handed him the papers without ceremony. She simply gave them back. She later said she had not read them because she felt they were not hers to read. That act, the restraint of it, the trust and the grief packed inside that gesture, is one of the most quietly devastating things in the historical record. A small light films the moment without explanation or decoration. No swelling score, no close-up held too long. Just Miep opening a drawer and Otto receiving what's inside. Belle Powley said she and Liev Schreiber ran the scene twice before filming. Both times they ended up standing in silence afterward, not because they were preparing, but because there was nothing to say. The scene in its final cut runs under 2 minutes. Critics called it the emotional center of the entire series. It probably is, because it contains everything. The survival, the loss, the love, the guilt, the world that came after, compressed into one drawer opening and 2 pairs of hands. Number 11. The show does something almost no Holocaust drama attempts. It lets Miep be angry, not sad, not noble, not quietly resolute. Genuinely messily angry at the situation, at the war, at the people she is protecting, at herself for the moments she resents them. The writers said this was the hardest tone to defend in the writers' room. There was enormous pressure, internal and external, to keep Miep sympathetic in conventional ways, to sand the rougher edges into something more palatable for audiences who came in already grieving. Rader and Phelan refused. They argued that sanitizing Miep's anger was its own form of disrespect. Real people trapped in impossible situations feel impossible things. They feel resentment and exhaustion, and the specific rage of having no good choices left. Belle Powley said the scenes where Miep breaks, where she slams something down, or walks out, or simply sits and shakes, were the scenes she found most important to get right. Not because anger is heroic, but because it's true. And the show's insistence on that truth, on showing the full cost of what Miep carried inside her own body and her own marriage, is what separates it from hagiography. A saint doesn't help you understand anything. A frightened, furious young woman who helps anyway. That's the thing that keeps you up at night.
I've lost everything, and still they resist.
Number 12. The casting of Anne Frank was a decision the producers agonized over longer than almost any other element of the production. They needed someone who could hold an iconic role without being crushed by it, who could bring freshness to a character so mythologized that audiences would unconsciously resist any interpretation that didn't match their internal image. They cast Ashley Brooke, and the direction they gave her was counterintuitive and quietly brilliant. They told her not to play Anne Frank the symbol. They told her to play a teenage girl who sometimes drives adults crazy. Anne, in a small light, is funny, impulsive, occasionally maddening, full of opinions about everything, deeply self-conscious, and almost unbearably alive. Because every scene Anne fills with her particular vivid energy carries the shadow of what the audience already knows is coming. The writers didn't need to manufacture tragedy. They just needed to make her real enough that losing her hit like losing someone you personally knew. By the end, it did exactly that. Several reviewers noted they cried not at the ending, which the show handles obliquely, but at an ordinary moment midway through. A scene where Anne laughs at something small, and the laugh sounds so completely like a real teenager that the grief arrives before you have time to prepare for it. Number 13. The production worked closely with the Anne Frank House in Amsterdam throughout development, and that collaboration came with an unexpected emotional burden. The archivists and historians at the museum opened their records completely, offering documents, photographs, and personal testimonies that had never been used in any prior dramatization. Some of those materials were not in the public record. Letters, photographs of people in the network, documents showing the specific bureaucratic machinery of deportation, the forms, the stamps, the filed paperwork through which human beings were systematically erased. The writers and directors who reviewed those materials said the effect was cumulative and destabilizing. You can read about the Holocaust in aggregate and maintain a certain protective distance. When you are looking at a carbon-copied deportation form with a specific name on it, a name you've been writing dialogue for, that distance collapses entirely. Several crew members sought counseling during production. The showrunners built formal check-ins into the production schedule after the first 2 weeks of research. When it became clear that the material was affecting people in ways that needed acknowledgement and support, not just professionalism and forward momentum. Number 14. There is a scene in A Small Light that the writers almost cut because they were afraid it would be misread. It involves Miep being offered a way out, a moment where someone she trusts gives her a credible, practical reason to step back from the risk she is carrying, to pass the responsibility to someone else and walk away with her own life intact. It isn't framed as cowardice, it's framed as reason, and Miep considers it. The camera holds on that consideration without rushing her toward the obvious noble choice. The writers said the point was never whether she would walk away. The point was to show the audience the full width of the door she decided not to go through. Because heroism that costs nothing is not heroism, it's convenience. What makes Miep's choice mean anything is that the alternative was real and available and reasonable, and she looked directly at it and turned back toward danger anyway. That beat, quiet and undecorated, hit test audiences harder than any of the more dramatic sequences in the series. Not because it was louder, because it was the one moment where the show trusted its audience to understand what stillness and silence can hold. Number 15. The show was designed for a global audience, but the history it depicts sits very differently in different national contexts. In Germany, in Poland, in the Netherlands, the occupation is not a historical curiosity. It is a generational inheritance with specific weight. The producers worked with cultural consultants in each of those countries to ensure the promotional framing didn't flatten the story into generic inspirational content, because the story is not generically inspirational. It is specific and uncomfortable and asks things of its audience that a highlight reel cannot capture. In the Netherlands particularly, the response to the show's treatment of collaboration and bystander behavior was intense and divided. Critics praised it. Some audiences pushed back hard. The show depicts something Dutch national identity has reckoned with painfully for decades, that the Netherlands had one of the highest rates of Jewish deportation in Western Europe, and that the reasons for that are not simple. A Small Light doesn't deliver verdicts. It shows how fear works on people gradually, how small surrenders pile into something monstrous before anyone quite names it, how most people aren't heroes or villains, but something in between that history struggles to categorize. Both the praise and the pushback were, in their own way, exactly the response the show was built to earn. Number 16. The score for A Small Light was composed by Anne Nikitin, and her approach was built around a single guiding principle she described as resistance to resolution. Most dramatic scores offer the audience emotional cues, signaling when to feel grief, when to feel hope, when to exhale. Nikitin deliberately withheld those cues. Her music doesn't resolve, it circles. It creates tension without releasing it. It sits underneath scenes without explaining them. She said she kept asking herself what music would mean to someone who couldn't play it out loud, who had to carry every feeling silently inside a small building while the world moved freely outside. The result is a score that critics found unsettling in the best possible sense. It doesn't comfort you. It keeps you in the room with the characters, inside the same suspended uncertainty they inhabit every single day. Several reviewers noted that watching the show without sound and then rewatching with the score revealed how much emotional weight was being carried by Nikitin's restraint. The silence inside the music was doing work that dialogue could not reach. In a story about people who could not make noise, a score built from withheld resolution was perhaps the most honest artistic choice the production made. Number 17. There is something the show carries in its final episode that it refuses to explain or annotate. Otto Frank returned from Auschwitz as the only surviving member of his immediate family. His wife Edith had died in the camp. His daughters Margot and Anne had died in Bergen-Belsen just weeks before liberation. He came back to Amsterdam, to a city that was free but not healed, to a life that had been administratively and physically dismantled while he was imprisoned. A Small Light shows Otto's return with devastating economy. It doesn't dwell, it doesn't editorialize. It shows a man arriving somewhere that used to be home and no longer is, and the people still there trying to figure out what they owe him and what they cannot possibly give back. Liev Schreiber said, filming those final scenes felt unlike anything preceding them. The war was over, and yet nothing was over. That specific historical experience. Survival without rescue, liberation without restoration, is something the show holds without resolving, because it didn't resolve. Not for Otto, not for Miep, Not for anyone who came back to a world that had continued without asking their permission. Some doors the show opens, it refuses to close because the real ones never were. Number 18. In awards conversations, a small light kept running into a specific form of resistance that the showrunners found both frustrating and revealing. Some critics and voters expressed discomfort with calling it entertainment, as though the gravity of its subject matter placed it in a category above being watched for pleasure and discussed around tables. Rader and Phelan pushed back on that framing directly and forcefully. They argued that the assumption serious history must be somber and difficult and not quite enjoyable is precisely the attitude that keeps important stories from reaching the audiences who need them most. A Small Light was built to be compelling. It was made to pull people in, hold them, make them laugh at Miep's stubbornness, and ache at Jan's silences, and then sit very still when the darkness arrives. Because that sequence, warmth followed by grief, is the only order that produces genuine reckoning. Stories that feel like medicine don't get watched to the end. Stories that feel like life do. And the only stories that change anything are the ones people actually finish. Number 19. Miep Gies was asked hundreds of times over the course of her long life whether she ever regretted what she did. She always gave the same answer. No, but then she would add something that journalists sometimes cut and audiences sometimes missed. She said the one thing she regretted was not being able to do more. Not the risk, not the fear, not the years of carrying what she carried. She regretted the limit of what one person could hold. That answer sits at the center of A Small Light in a way that doesn't announce itself, but is present in every single scene. Miep at her desk, Miep in the market, Miep lying awake in the dark beside a sleeping husband who is also carrying things he cannot say out loud. The show is not finally a story about what heroism looks like from the outside. It is a story about the gap between what was possible and what was needed, and the people who stood in that gap knowing it wasn't enough, and kept standing there regardless, day after ordinary day, until the day they couldn't anymore. Number 20. The final image of A Small Light is not of Anne. It is not of the secret annex or liberation or flags or any of the symbolic imagery that war stories tend to reach for when they need to close. It is of Miep, ordinary still, sitting in a room that is finally quiet. What the show understands, and what that last image carries without a single word of dialogue, is that survival is its own kind of sentence. The war ended, the hiding ended, the danger ended, but Miep Gies carried the weight of those 2 years, those 8 people, and those diary pages for 65 more years of her life. Not as a burden she resented, as a responsibility she had chosen, and would choose again without hesitation. The final image doesn't offer peace or closure, or any of the things endings are supposed to provide. It offers presence, a woman who stayed when she could have left, a light that had every reason to go out, that kept burning in the small, determined, unglamorous way that actual courage burns, not brightly, not heroically, but steadily for as long as it was needed. Bonus fact. The showrunners have spoken about one scene they almost didn't write, not because it was too dark, but because it felt too private. Late in production, they included a brief moment where Miep, alone, takes out the diary pages she has been hiding in her desk and holds them without opening them. She doesn't read them. She just holds the pages and then puts them back. It isn't in the historical record. It's imagined, but it came from something Miep had said in an interview decades earlier, that there were days she thought about opening that drawer and reading what was inside and learning whether Anne had written about her, what she had thought, whether she had understood how much she was loved. Miep said she never did, because the pages were not hers. The scene lasts 11 seconds. Not one person who watched the screener reported it as their favorite moment, but almost every single one of them mentioned it later, quietly, as the moment the whole series finally broke them open. That's what the best storytelling does. It doesn't announce its most important moments. It just leaves them in a drawer and trusts you to feel the weight.